August 25, 1944. Paris, France. The cobblestone streets of the Latin Quarter shimmered with morning light as the distant rumble of military vehicles announced the arrival of Allied forces. Captain Marcus Williams of the 761st Transportation Battalion stood tall in his pressed uniform, clipboard in hand, tasked with coordinating supply distribution for the newly liberated city. As Parisians erupted in celebration around him, Marcus smiled quietly, believing his battalion would simply deliver supplies and then move on to the next strategic location. He had no idea that within 3 months his soldiers would become the talk of Paris, changing hearts and challenging the very foundations of military segregation. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how African-American servicemen in Paris created an unexpected cultural revolution that the military leadership never anticipated, transforming both a European capital and American racial politics in ways that would echo for generations. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Seine as Sergeant James Monroe directed his team to unload supply trucks near the Hôtel de Ville. At 26 years old, the former mathematics teacher from Philadelphia carried himself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect despite the constraints of serving in a segregated military. "Keep those crates moving, gentlemen. The French authorities need these medical supplies distributed to 5 hospitals before nightfall," Monroe called out, checking his clipboard. Private First Class Robert Johnson, a lanky 19-year-old from Georgia with a perpetual grin, hoisted a crate onto his shoulder. "Sergeant, these people sure are treating us different than folks back home. That old woman just gave me a flower and kissed both my cheeks." "Focus on the job, Private," Monroe replied, though he couldn't suppress a small smile. "We're here to work, not socialize." Nearby, Corporal Thomas Jenkins, 32, a former jazz musician from Chicago, carefully guided a truck into position. "Hate to disagree, Sarge, but I think socialization might be part of our unofficial duties. That French officer just invited our entire squad to some kind of celebration tonight." Monroe sighed, knowing he should refuse. But the genuine warmth of the Parisian welcome was unlike anything most of his men had ever experienced. The segregated 761st Transportation Battalion, like most African-American units, was typically relegated to support roles far from the spotlight. But Paris in the summer of 1944 was different. Here they were simply American liberators. "We will consider it after all deliveries are complete," Monroe finally conceded. Meanwhile, across the city at Supreme Allied Command headquarters, Brigadier General Lawrence Miller frowned at the deployment maps spread across his massive oak desk. His aide, Lieutenant William Cooper, stood at attention as the general jabbed his finger at the colored pins representing support units. "Cooper, we've got too many colored troops stationed in Paris proper. What were they thinking? Move these battalions eastward with the advance. We need them for supply lines, not occupation duty." "Sir, transportation and quartermaster units are essential for civilian relief efforts," Cooper ventured carefully. "The French authorities have specifically requested additional support for food and medical distribution." Miller leaned back in his chair. 3 weeks, Lieutenant. 3 weeks maximum presence in the city center, then reassign them to forward positions. I don't want our colored troops getting too comfortable with European freedoms. Creates complications." "Yes, sir," Cooper replied, making notes though his expression betrayed a hint of disapproval. A Yale graduate with progressive views he carefully kept hidden, Cooper had seen firsthand the competence of African-American units, despite the limitations placed upon them. Back in the Latin Quarter, Private Wilbur Lewis found himself separated from his unit after delivering medical supplies to a small hospital. At 23, the former college student from Boston carried a small leather notebook where he jotted observations in elegant handwriting. Standing confused at an intersection, map in hand, he failed to notice the young woman approaching until she spoke. "You are lost, American?" Her English carried a lyrical French accent. Lewis turned to find a woman about his age, her dark hair pulled back, wearing a simple blue dress. She carried a bag of groceries and regarded him with curious eyes, rather than the suspicion he'd grown accustomed to from white women back home. Yes, mademoiselle. Trying to find my way back to the rendezvous point, he admitted, showing her the map. I am Marie Dubois, university student. Before the occupation closed our schools, she introduced herself. This map is outdated. Come, I will show you the correct way. Private Wilbur Lewis, 761st Transportation Battalion, he responded with a slight bow. I appreciate your help, but I wouldn't want to trouble you. Marie smiled. It is no trouble. Americans liberated our city. The least I can do is help one find his way. Besides, I have questions about America. We have read about your Langston Hughes and Louis Armstrong. Are you from Harlem? Lewis laughed. Boston, actually. My father teaches literature at a college there. As they walked, Marie asked questions about American universities, jazz music, and literature, with an intellectual curiosity that Lewis found refreshing. When they reached the rendezvous point, she hesitated, then spoke quickly. My friends and I meet tomorrow evening at Café Rousseau to discuss books and ideas. Perhaps you would come. Tell us about American writers. Before he could respond, Sergeant Monroe called out from the supply truck. Lewis, we've been looking for you. Get moving. I have to go, Lewis said apologetically. Marie nodded. Café Rousseau, 7 o'clock. Rue Saint-Jacques. She smiled and walked away before he could answer. Back at the temporary barracks established in a former school building, Captain Williams addressed his company after evening mess. The spacious classroom still featured maps of pre-war Europe on its walls, with desks pushed to the sides to make room for military cots. Gentlemen, we have been assigned to Paris for the next 3 weeks minimum. Our primary mission is supply distribution and infrastructure support. Williams paced as he spoke. While the French citizens have been welcoming, remember that you represent the United States Army, and your conduct must be exemplary at all times. Private Johnson raised his hand. Sir, some local officials invited us to a celebration tomorrow evening. Some kind of liberation party at the town hall. Said they wanted to thank all the American units. Williams exchanged glances with Monroe before responding. I'll look into it. If legitimate, we'll send a delegation. He paused. One more thing. Unlike back home, the French do not practice segregation. This does not change our military protocols. Clear? Yes, sir, came the unified response, though many exchanged meaningful looks. After dismissal, Lewis approached Monroe. Sergeant, requesting permission to visit a local establishment tomorrow evening. Educational purpose. Monroe raised an eyebrow. Educational? Yes, sir. University students discussing literature. Thought I might learn about French perspectives on the occupation. Could be valuable information. Monroe studied the younger man carefully. Approved, but be back by 2200 hours. And Lewis, be careful. Not everyone may share the young lady's openness. Lewis blushed. How did you? I have eyes, Private, Monroe said with a rare smile. The next evening, Wilbur Lewis stood outside Café Rousseau, having changed into his cleanest uniform. Through the window, he could see a lively group of young people engaged in animated conversation. Taking a deep breath, he entered. The café fell momentarily silent as heads turned toward him. Then Marie stood, waving him over to a table where 5 other students sat surrounded by books and coffee cups. Friends, this is the American I mentioned, Private Lewis, she announced. He studies literature in Boston. A young man with wire-rimmed glasses extended his hand. Jean-Pierre Lafont, please join us. We were discussing whether Hemingway truly understands the French character. What followed was 2 hours of the most intellectually stimulating conversation Lewis had experienced since leaving college. The French students asked thoughtful questions about African-American writers and seemed genuinely interested in his perspectives on everything from jazz to democracy. Is it true that in America you cannot enter certain establishments? Asked Sophie, a philosophy student with short blonde hair. Lewis hesitated. Yes, segregation is law in southern states and practice in most northern ones. Jean-Pierre looked confused. But you fight for democracy. You liberate us from fascism. The contradiction isn't lost on us, Lewis replied quietly. Meanwhile, at the Hotel de Ville celebration, Captain Williams watched as his small delegation of soldiers, including Monroe, Jenkins, and Johnson, were warmly received by French officials. The elegant reception hall gleamed with chandeliers as a small orchestra played a mixture of French and American songs. Mayor Robert Sharon, a dignified man in his 60s who had secretly supported the resistance, approached Williams with 2 champagne glasses. "Captain, we are honored by your presence. Your men have been instrumental in restoring medical services to our eastern districts." Williams accepted the glass with a nod. "Thank you, sir, we're simply doing our duty." "Perhaps in America," Sharon replied, "but here, you should know that we see no distinction between your units and others. All Americans are heroes to Paris tonight." Across the room, Corporal Jenkins had discovered the piano and, after some encouragement, began playing jazz standards that soon had French officials and their wives tapping their feet. When he launched into a rendition of La Marseillaise with a swing interpretation, the room erupted in delighted applause. A distinguished older woman in an elegant black dress approached him afterward. "Magnificent, Corporal. I am Madame Rousseau. Before the war, I operated the most exclusive music hall in Paris. Would you and your musically inclined friends consider performing a special concert to celebrate liberation?" Jenkins looked startled. "Ma'am, I'm not sure our commanding officers would—" "I have already spoken with your captain," she interrupted with a sly smile. "He says with proper approvals and during off-duty hours he has no objection. I have connections with your Special Services Division." By the time the delegation returned to barracks, word was spreading through the company about both Lewis's intellectual salon and Jenkins's potential concert. For men accustomed to restricted movement and limited interaction with local populations during deployment, Paris was becoming something none had expected, a place of possibility. The following morning, Lieutenant Cooper arrived at the 761st's headquarters with new orders. Captain Williams welcomed him into the makeshift office, offering coffee from a recently acquired French press. "What brings supreme command to our humble operation, Lieutenant?" Cooper placed a folder on the desk. "Revised deployment schedules. General Miller wants accelerated transition. Your company should prepare to move to eastern support positions within 10 days instead of 3 weeks. Williams frowned as he reviewed the documents. "With respect, our current distribution network is just becoming effective. The hospitals in particular—" "I understand, Captain," Cooper interrupted, lowering his voice. "Between us, I believe the General is concerned about the level of integration occurring between your men and the local population." Williams's expression hardened. "My men have conducted themselves with exemplary professionalism." "I don't disagree," Cooper said carefully. "But reports of jazz performances and university discussions have reached headquarters. Some feel it's creating an unrealistic environment." "Unrealistic," Williams repeated coldly. Cooper hesitated. "Their words, not mine. I'm here unofficially to suggest that if these activities were less visible, perhaps the urgency to redeploy might diminish." After Cooper departed, Williams called in Sergeant Monroe for consultation. "They want us gone because the French are treating us like human beings," Monroe said after hearing the situation. "Can't have us getting ideas about equality." Williams nodded grimly. "Or worse, having white troops see it happening. But I'm not inclined to restrict the men's limited freedoms during off-duty hours when their performance remains exceptional." "What do you suggest, sir?" "Discretion, Sergeant. Smaller groups, less public venues. And perhaps we demonstrate our value so convincingly that even General Miller can't justify our redeployment." Over the next week, a remarkable transformation occurred. During the day, the men of the 761st performed their duties with heightened efficiency, establishing distribution centers in every district and creating an inventory system so effective that even Supreme Command took notice. During off-duty hours, small groups of soldiers found themselves welcomed into Parisian life in ways both subtle and profound. Jenkins and 3 other musically talented men performed not at a grand concert hall, but at small neighborhood gatherings organized by Madame Rousseau. Lewis and his intellectual friends moved their discussions from the café to private apartments, where literature gave way to deeper conversations about democracy, racism, and the future of both their countries. Most surprisingly, genuine friendships and romances began to blossom. Private Johnson found himself teaching English to a baker's daughter named Claudette in exchange for French lessons. Corporal Jenkins discovered that Madame Rousseau's granddaughter, Josephine, shared both his love of music and his quick wit, and Wilbur Lewis and Marie Dubois, having moved far beyond literary discussions, now spent hours walking along the Seine, sharing dreams and experiences that transcended national boundaries. For Captain Williams, watching his men experience acceptance based on character rather than color was both heartening and concerning. He knew that whatever happened in Paris would eventually collide with the harsh realities awaiting them back home. His concerns materialized sooner than expected, when Brigadier General Miller himself appeared for an unannounced inspection exactly 1 week after Cooper's visit. The General's staff car pulled up to the school building as Williams was reviewing distribution reports. Monroe quickly alerted the captain, who straightened his uniform before stepping outside to greet the unexpected visitor. "General Miller, welcome to our operation. We weren't informed of your visit." Miller, a tall man with steel-gray hair and perpetual frown lines, barely acknowledged the salute. "That was intentional, Captain. Supreme Command has received concerning reports about your unit's activities. I'm here to see for myself." Over the next hour, Miller inspected the supply operations with a critical eye, asking pointed questions about efficiency metrics and distribution priorities. To his evident frustration, the operation was functioning flawlessly, with French civilian authorities working seamlessly alongside the American troops. "Your men seem quite comfortable with the local population," Miller observed coolly as they watched Corporal Jenkins conversing in halting French with a hospital administrator. "They've developed effective working relationships, sir. It improves our operational efficiency." Miller's eyes narrowed. "I've also heard reports of after-hours fraternization, jazz performances, social gatherings, even rumors of romantic entanglements." Williams maintained his professional demeanor. "My men conduct themselves appropriately during off-duty hours, sir. Their personal time is their own, as long as they follow Army regulations and local laws." "There are considerations beyond regulations, Captain," Miller said sharply. "The European theater presents unique social dynamics that could create unrealistic expectations among your men. With respect, sir, my men are well aware of the realities awaiting them back home, but denying them basic human interactions while deployed seems counterproductive to morale and performance." The general's jaw tightened. 3 days, Captain. Your unit transfers to Eastern supply routes in 3 days. That's final." News of the imminent redeployment spread quickly through the company. That evening, an impromptu gathering formed in the barracks courtyard as men discussed what the change would mean. "Just when we started making real connections," Johnson lamented, "Claudette was going to introduce me to her entire family this weekend." Jenkins nodded soberly. "Madame Rousseau arranged for us to record some music at a small studio. Actual records, man. Never thought I'd see the day." Lewis sat quietly, turning a small book of French poetry in his hands. Marie had given it to him just that afternoon, inscribed with her address and a note asking him to write when the war ended. Sergeant Monroe watched the men with understanding, but addressed them practically. "We all knew Paris was temporary. We're soldiers first. The Eastern Front needs supply lines." "It's not about the deployment," Lewis finally spoke up. "It's about why they're moving us specifically. We've all seen the other units staying in position." Captain Williams, who had been listening silently, stepped forward. "The 761st has performed admirably in Paris. Whatever the reasoning behind our new orders, we will carry that same excellence eastward." He paused. "That said, you have 48 hours of remaining time in Paris. I suggest you make it meaningful." The next 2 days saw a flurry of activity as the men of the 761st said their goodbyes while preparing for deployment. Jenkins and his impromptu band recorded 6 jazz standards in a tiny studio, with copies promised to be sent to their next position. Johnson spent an emotional evening with Claudette's family, who treated him to a home-cooked meal and extracted promises of letters. For Lewis, saying goodbye to Marie proved most difficult. They met at Luxembourg Gardens, walking slowly among the autumn flowers. "I will write to you every week," she promised, her composure cracking slightly. "And when this terrible conflict ends, perhaps." Lewis took her hand, an act that would have resulted in violence in many American cities. "When the war ends, I'm coming back to Paris. That's a promise. I'm applying to Sorbonne if they'll have me." "They would be fools to refuse you," she said fiercely. Unknown to either of them, their farewell was observed by Lieutenant Cooper, who had been sent to oversee transition logistics. Rather than reporting the interaction, he deliberately turned away, making a personal decision that would have significant consequences later. On the morning of departure, the 761st formed up in precise rows, their trucks loaded and ready for the eastward journey. To everyone's surprise, a substantial crowd of French civilians had gathered to bid them farewell, including many familiar faces from their brief time in the city. Mayor Sharon himself approached Captain Williams with an official envelope bearing the seal of Paris. "Captain, the City Council has prepared a formal commendation for your unit's exceptional service during our early liberation period. We have also sent copies to your Supreme Command." Williams accepted the document with surprise. "Thank you, Mr. Mayor, this is unexpected." Sharon lowered his voice. "We understand the circumstances of your reassignment, Captain. Paris does not share such prejudices. This commendation makes that clear in diplomatic language even your generals cannot easily dismiss." As the convoy prepared to depart, Madame Rousseau approached Jenkins with a package. "Your recordings, Corporal, and something more. My contacts in New York. When you return home, they will be expecting your call." All along the line, similar scenes played out as Parisians pressed small gifts, contact information, and promises of future correspondence into the hands of departing soldiers. Marie gave Louis a final letter, too personal to open in public. Claudette tied a blue ribbon around Johnson's wrist, a French tradition for travelers. When the convoy finally pulled away, the men of the 761st were uncharacteristically quiet, each lost in thoughts about what they were leaving behind and what awaited them both at the front and eventually back home. Sergeant Munro, riding beside Captain Williams in the lead vehicle, finally broke the silence. "Something's changed, hasn't it, sir? For all of us." Williams nodded slowly. "Paris showed them a different possibility, Munro. Once seen, that can't be unseen." What neither man could know was that the story of the 761st in Paris was only beginning to unfold. The letters would soon start flowing both ways across the Atlantic. The connections formed in those brief weeks would spread through networks of family and friends, creating ripples that would eventually help fuel social changes neither the Army nor America itself had anticipated. And in the offices of Supreme Allied Command, Lieutenant William Cooper was making a decision that would alter his own trajectory as he carefully filed the official Paris commendation where General Miller could not easily suppress it, ensuring that the achievements of the 761st would become part of the official record. As Paris faded into the distance behind them, Private Wilbur Lewis finally opened Marie's letter, reading her elegant handwriting promising not just personal devotion, but a partnership in creating change. The final lines resonated with particular power. "What happened between us in Paris is not just our story. It is perhaps the beginning of a new chapter for both our nations. Return to me when you can, but until then, let us both work to make your country live up to the ideals it claims to defend abroad." Lewis carefully refolded the letter, placing it in his breast pocket close to his heart, as the convoy continued eastward toward the uncertain futures that awaited them all. October 19, 1944, the eastern French countryside near Metz. Rain pounded the canvas roof of the command tent, where Captain Williams hunched over maps, planning the next day's supply routes. The 761st had been operating in forward positions for nearly a month, their efficiency earning reluctant praise even from skeptical white commanders. "Supply convoy requested at 0600 hours, Sergeant Munro reported, stepping into the tent and shaking water from his cap. "3rd Battalion needs ammunition and medical supplies before they advance." Williams nodded without looking up. "Weather report? Continuing rain, sir. Roads are deteriorating quickly. Select our best drivers. We'll need to—" Williams stopped as a runner appeared at the tent entrance. "Captain Williams? Message from headquarters, sir." Williams took the sealed envelope, noting the Supreme Allied Command header. Opening it, he read quickly, his expression shifting from concern to surprise. "What is it, sir?" Munro asked. "We're being temporarily reassigned. Half our company is to return to Paris immediately for special duty. Apparently, our previous service there has been recognized. What neither man could have anticipated was how the seeds planted during their brief 3 weeks in Paris had grown. The letters exchanged between soldiers and their French friends had circulated widely. The recordings Jenkins and his makeshift band created had found their way to influential ears. Most significantly, Lieutenant Cooper had ensured that the official commendation from the city of Paris reached not only General Miller's superiors, but also several prominent war correspondents. The resulting story, African-American troops specially honored by Paris, had appeared in several newspapers back home, including, crucially, the influential Chicago Defender and Pittsburgh Courier, whose combined reach extended to hundreds of thousands of African-American readers. The following morning, Captain Williams selected 50 men, including Monroe, Jenkins, Lewis, and Johnson, for the Paris assignment. As they prepared to depart, speculation ran wild. "Heard they need us for some big brass parade," Johnson said, stowing his gear in the transport truck, showing off America's diverse fighting force for the newsreels. Jenkins shook his head. "More likely they found our supply system worked too well. Probably want us to reorganize their mess." Lewis remained quiet, clutching a stack of letters from Marie that had somehow found him despite multiple redeployments. Each contained not just personal sentiments, but detailed accounts of how Parisian society had continued discussing the African-American soldiers long after their departure. The convoy reached Paris by nightfall, 2 days later. The city had changed in the weeks since their departure. More American troops were present, reconstruction efforts were visible everywhere, and a sense of normalcy was gradually returning to the once occupied capital. They were directed not to their former school barracks, but to a restored hotel near the Seine that had been converted to military accommodations. Inside the lobby, Lieutenant Cooper waited, now wearing the oak leaf insignia of a major. "Captain Williams, welcome back to Paris," Cooper greeted them, surprising the officers with a genuine smile. "I've been assigned as your liaison for this mission," Williams saluted. "Congratulations on your promotion, Major. May I ask what exactly this mission entails?" "Of course. Please assemble your men in the conference room in 20 minutes. All will be explained." When the selected members of the 761st gathered, they found not only Cooper, but also a French military delegation and several civilians, including Mayor Sharon. Cooper addressed the room. "Gentlemen, your company has been selected for a unique assignment. The Provisional French government is organizing a series of events to rebuild international relations and civilian morale. They specifically requested your unit based on the connections you established during your previous deployment." Mayor Charon stepped forward. "Your company made an extraordinary impression on Paris, Captain Williams. When Supreme Allied Command asked how they might assist our recovery efforts, we requested your men by name." He smiled. "We were quite persistent." Williams glanced at Cooper, who gave an almost imperceptible nod, confirming what remained unspoken. The French had outmaneuvered military segregationists through diplomatic channels too public to be denied. "The assignment is 3 weeks minimum," Cooper continued. "Your men will assist with everything from supply distribution to cultural exchange events. Given your proven capabilities and the relationships already established, you were the natural choice." After the briefing, as the men were dismissed to settle into their quarters, Cooper drew Williams aside. "There's more to this than a goodwill mission, Captain," he said quietly. "War correspondents have taken an interest in your unit's reception here. The French treatment of African-American troops has become something of a story back home." Williams raised an eyebrow. "Is that why General Miller agreed to this assignment?" "Miller was overruled," Cooper replied with a faint smile. "The political implications of refusing a direct request from our most visible liberated ally were deemed problematic." The next morning brought reunions no one had dared hope for. The 761st's return had spread rapidly through Parisian networks. As they assembled for duty assignments in the hotel lobby, familiar faces began appearing. Madame Rousseau swept in like royalty, immediately locating Jenkins. "Corporal, your recordings have caused quite a sensation. Radio Paris has played them twice weekly since you left. People are calling it liberation jazz." Jenkins stared in disbelief. "They're actually broadcasting our music?" "Indeed, and I've arranged studio time next week to record more. Properly this time, with professional equipment," She lowered her voice. "Your American music executives will be very interested when they hear these recordings after the war." Across the lobby, Johnson found himself speechless as Claudette appeared with her father, the baker. They carried baskets of fresh bread for the returning soldiers. "You kept your promise to write," she said, her English noticeably improved. "Papa has been practicing English too, just to read your letters about Georgia." The baker nodded proudly. "My daughter teaches me, very difficult, but I learn to understand where our American friends come from." For Louis, the reunion with Marie was more subdued, but no less powerful. She arrived carrying books and newspapers, her face lighting up when she spotted him. "Wilbur," she said simply, crossing the room to embrace him publicly, an act that still startled him despite their correspondence. "I've brought you something." She handed him a small stack of newspaper clippings and journals. Looking through them, Louis realized they were articles and editorial pieces about African-American soldiers in Paris, their reception, and broader discussions about democracy and racial equality. "These have been appearing regularly since you left," Marie explained. "Your presence here started conversations that never stopped. Philosophy professors, writers, everyday citizens, all discussing the contradiction." "The contradiction? How America can fight for freedom abroad while denying it at home." She squeezed his hand. "Your letters documenting your experiences have been shared more widely than you know." Captain Williams observed these reunions with mixed emotions. The genuine connections warmed his heart, but the implications concerned him. Major Cooper approached, following his gaze. "Your men seem to have left quite an impression, Captain." Williams nodded. "I'm beginning to understand why our return caused such consternation at headquarters. Indeed. The official mission is legitimate. Your unit will coordinate supplies for civilian reconstruction and participate in diplomatic functions. The unofficial consequence is that these relationships will continue to develop, and the story will grow." Cooper hesitated. "There are those who see this as problematic, and others who see opportunity." "And which category includes you, Major?" Cooper met his eyes directly. "I believe the contradiction Marie Dubois referenced cannot stand indefinitely. The question is whether it resolves toward justice or deeper entrenchment." The following weeks saw the 761st engage in their official duties with characteristic efficiency, establishing supply chains for reconstruction projects throughout Paris. But it was their unofficial impact that proved most significant. Jenkins and his band recorded 8 new compositions with Madame Rousseau's connections, creating music that blended American jazz with French influences. These Paris sessions would eventually make their way to New York, London, and beyond, credited explicitly to Corporal Thomas Jenkins and the 761st Liberation Band. Johnson found himself not only continuing English lessons with Claudette, but being invited to speak at her former school, where Parisian children peppered him with questions about America that required carefully balanced answers, reflecting both patriotism and painful truths. Most significantly, Louis and several other educated men from the unit began participating in a series of public discussions at the Sorbonne titled Democracy's Future, organized by Marie and her professor. These forums attracted significant attention, with French intellectuals engaging directly with African-American soldiers about their experiences and perspectives. After one particularly powerful session, where Louis eloquently described growing up in Boston's segregated neighborhoods while studying the American Constitution's promises of equality, a correspondent from the Paris edition of Stars and Stripes approached him. "Private Louis, James Randolph, Stars and Stripes, would you be willing to be interviewed about these forums? We're running a piece on Franco-American cultural exchange." Louis hesitated, looking to Sergeant Munro, who had attended as observer. Munro considered briefly before nodding. "The captain would want you to clear specific quotes, but I see no reason to decline." The resulting article, Black GIs and French Intellectuals Debate Democracy's Meaning, was intended just for the military newspaper. However, when it appeared, a civilian journalist from the Associated Press attended the next forum, followed by representatives from several French newspapers. By the beginning of the 3rd week, Captain Williams found himself summoned to Major Cooper's office at headquarters, unsurprised to find a copy of Stars and Stripes on the desk alongside several French publications. "Your men are becoming quite the cultural ambassadors," Cooper said, his tone carefully neutral. Williams stood at attention. "They've conducted themselves with absolute propriety. Sir?" "At ease, Captain. I didn't call you here for reprimand." Cooper gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Quite the contrary. Supreme Command has received a request from the French Ministry of Culture to extend your company's assignment for an additional month, specifically to expand these cultural exchanges." Williams sat down slowly. "That would be unprecedented." "Entirely. General Miller is apoplectic." Cooper couldn't quite hide his satisfaction. "But the request comes through diplomatic channels with endorsements from 3 resistance leaders now in government positions. Denying it would create political complications at a time when Allied unity is paramount. What are your orders, sir?" "To inform you that your assignment is extended, and unofficially, to suggest that your men continue exactly as they have been." Cooper leaned forward. "What's happening here is remarkable, Williams. These soldiers are changing perceptions not just among the French, but among white American troops stationed here, who read these articles and attend these events." That evening, Williams gathered his officers to explain the extension. The news was met with poorly concealed excitement. "There's something else you should know," Williams added after explaining their new timetable. "Our activities here have attracted attention beyond Paris, both positive and negative." Monroe nodded gravely. "The men should maintain exemplary conduct. Higher visibility means higher scrutiny." "Precisely. Remind them that they represent not just themselves or this unit, but possibilities for the future." As the meeting dispersed, Lewis approached the captain privately. "Sir, Marie and the professor have proposed something more formal than the discussion forums. A documented collection of testimonies from our men about their experiences, both here and in America. A kind of historical record." Williams considered carefully. Who would read these accounts? Initially just the academic community, but they believe it could eventually become a book, something that survives after we're gone. "Proceed cautiously, Lewis. Collect the testimonies. Let me review them before submission." The extension of the 761st's Paris assignment created ripple effects throughout the Allied force structure. Other African American units began requesting urban deployment rotations, citing the precedent. Several white officers who had observed the Sorbonne forums wrote reports recommending broader integration of units based on operational effectiveness rather than race. Meanwhile, Paris itself continued embracing the soldiers with increasing boldness. Restaurants and cafes that hosted members of the 761st began displaying photos and testimonials in their windows. Children in the neighborhoods they served drew pictures of black and white soldiers working together, images that found their way into local newspapers. When Jenkins' band gave its first public performance at a small left bank venue, the audience included not only Parisians, but white American officers and enlisted men who had read about the liberation jazz phenomenon. The integrated audience was captured by a photographer from Life magazine who had been in Paris covering reconstruction efforts. By mid-November, what had begun as a minor diplomatic concession had evolved into something the military hierarchy could neither control nor easily terminate. The story had grown beyond Paris, with abbreviated versions appearing in newspapers throughout France and making their way back to America through military postal channels and foreign correspondence. For the men themselves, the experience was transformative. Private Johnson, once the company jokester, found himself seriously discussing his future with Claudette's family, including the possibility of returning to France after the war, or perhaps bringing her to a Northern American city where mixed marriages, while difficult, were at least legal. "You could study at university here," her father suggested during Sunday dinner at their apartment. Many Americans came to Paris after the last war, writers, artists, musicians. Johnson smiled sadly. "Different Americans, sir, with different opportunities." "Perhaps, but Paris does not make such distinctions, and after what you have done for our city, doors would open." For Corporal Jenkins, music had created possibilities he'd never imagined. Madame Rousseau had connected him with French musicians who treated him as an equal and valued collaborator rather than a novelty. Their joint recordings were being preserved with plans for commercial release after the war. "You must consider returning to Paris when this conflict ends," Josephine, Madame Rousseau's granddaughter, told him as they walked along the Seine one evening. Their friendship had deepened into something more, though both carefully avoided defining it given the uncertainties of war. "I'd like that," Jenkins admitted, "but the world after war never quite matches what we imagined during it." She took his hand, an act still startling in its casualness. "Then we must work to shape that world, no? Your music already does this. It makes people feel what equality sounds like before they can articulate what equality means." The most profound transformation, however, was evident in Louis. His relationship with Marie had evolved into an intellectual and emotional partnership that transcended romance. Together they had documented dozens of testimonies from soldiers in the unit, creating a historical record that captured not just their experiences in Paris, but their reflections on what those experiences revealed about possibilities for change. "These stories matter," Marie told him, as they organized the growing collection of papers in her small apartment near the university. "They prove that what America claims is impossible is actually just unwanted by those in power." "They also show that change is not simply about law," Louis replied. "Your people welcomed us because your culture permitted it, despite official German policies during occupation that tried to force racial hierarchies upon you." "Culture and law must evolve together," she agreed. "Neither alone is sufficient." As November progressed, the extended assignment neared its conclusion. Military necessity would soon pull the 761st back to support roles for the continuing Allied advance. Both the soldiers and their Parisian friends felt the approaching separation acutely, knowing that wartime relationships faced uncertain futures. 3 days before their scheduled departure, Mayor Charon organized a formal ceremony at the Hôtel de Ville to recognize the 761st's contributions to Paris's recovery. The event, attended by military officials from multiple Allied nations, as well as French dignitaries, represented a public acknowledgement that would become part of official record. "The citizens of Paris recognize in these men the true spirit of American democracy," Charon declared in his address, which was translated for the international audience. "They have shown us not just efficiency in distribution of supplies, but generosity of spirit that transcends national and cultural boundaries." Captain Williams, accepting a formal commendation on behalf of his company, responded with measured words that nonetheless carried unmistakable significance. "The men of the 761st Transportation Battalion have found in Paris a place where their service is valued based on its quality rather than limited by preconceptions. This experience has enriched us as soldiers and as human beings." The ceremony concluded with Jenkins's band performing a special composition titled Paris Liberation Suite, which blended American jazz with French classical influences. The performance received a standing ovation, with several prominent French musicians in attendance openly discussing post-war collaborations. That evening, a final gathering took place at Café Rousseau, now informally adopted as the 761st's unofficial headquarters. Soldiers and their French friends shared memories, exchanged contact information, and made promises that all knew would be challenged by distance and circumstance. Louis and Marie sat slightly apart from the others, their conversation more subdued. "I've spoken with my professor," she said quietly. "He believes several academic publishers would be interested in our collected testimonies after the war, perhaps in both French and English." Louis nodded. "I've made copies of everything. Sergeant Monroe has agreed to store one set separately in case mine are lost." "And us?" she asked directly. "What becomes of us when tomorrow comes?" Louis took her hands. "I meant what I wrote in every letter. When this war ends, I'm applying to study here. Boston will always be home, but Paris showed me possibilities I cannot forget or abandon. And if circumstances prevent your return, then we continue what we've started through our work and words. The stories we've collected, the connections we've documented, they're seeds planted that will grow regardless of whether we tend them together or separately." Across the café, similar conversations unfolded between Johnson and Claudette, Jenkins and Josephine, and dozens of others whose lives had intersected during this unexpected Parisian interlude. Addresses were exchanged, photographs taken, and promises made with varying degrees of certainty. Captain Williams, observing from near the entrance with Sergeant Munro and Major Cooper, who had been invited as a gesture of appreciation, reflected on the scene. "When we first arrived in Paris, I thought our greatest challenge would be maintaining military discipline amid civilian interaction," Williams said quietly. "I never anticipated we'd be navigating international publicity and romance." Munro nodded. "The men have changed, sir. They've seen themselves reflected differently in French eyes than in American ones. That vision doesn't disappear, even when the mirror is gone. The question," Cooper added, "is whether they can help others see that reflection when they return home." The following morning, as the company prepared for departure, the streets around their hotel filled with Parisians coming to say goodbye. Unlike their first departure, which had been marked by surprise and regret, this one carried the weight of shared purpose and commitment to connections that would endure. Marie brought Louis a package containing their completed manuscript, Voices of the 761st, Democracy's Promise and Practice, with copies already secured at the Sorbonne archives. "Your words will remain in Paris even as you leave," she told him, "and I will ensure they spread beyond these walls." Claudette presented Johnson with a family photograph and a small box of soil from her father's garden. "A piece of France to plant in Georgia someday," she explained, her voice breaking slightly. Madame Rousseau handed Jenkins an official document. "Your music is now registered with the French Artistic Rights Society. Your compositions will be protected and credited properly, with royalties held in trust until after the war." All along the line, similar exchanges took place, small moments of connection that defied military segregation and international boundaries. Captain Williams allowed these farewell moments to extend slightly beyond the scheduled departure time, recognizing their importance not just to morale but to history. When the convoy finally pulled away, the men of the 761st were changed in ways neither they nor the army could have anticipated when they first entered Paris months earlier. They carried with them not just memories, but documentary evidence of possibilities, letters, recordings, manuscripts, and photographs that would continue telling their story long after the war ended. What none of them could fully grasp in that moment was how widely their story had already spread, or how deeply it would influence post-war movements on both sides of the Atlantic. The articles published in Paris had made their way to African-American newspapers throughout the United States. The jazz recordings would eventually influence musicians in New York and Chicago. The academic testimonies would be cited by early civil rights organizations challenging segregation. Most significantly, the personal relationships formed, romantic and platonic alike, would create networks of correspondence that sustained international connections throughout the coming decades, providing channels for cultural exchange that circumvented official limitations. As the convoy reached the eastern checkpoint that would take them back toward the front lines, Louis unfolded Marie's final letter, reading words that captured what had happened in Paris. "What began as simple human recognition between individuals has become something larger, a demonstration that the barriers we are told are permanent are actually quite fragile when confronted with the simple truth of shared humanity. Whatever happens now, remember that Paris has witnessed and documented this truth. It cannot be erased from history." Years later, when asked about the unexpected impact of the 761st's time in Paris, Captain Marcus Williams, by then a history professor at Howard University, would explain it simply. "The army worried about romantic relationships forming, but they missed the real revolution. Yes, there were romances, some that endured and many that didn't. But the true transformation was in how those men saw themselves after experiencing life without the constant weight of American racial customs. They returned home carrying not just memories of individual Parisians who treated them with dignity, but evidence that an entire society could function differently than they had been told was possible. That knowledge spread person by person, letter by letter, record by record, until it helped fuel changes no one could stop." In 1948, when Corporal Thomas Jenkins returned to Paris with his band for a European tour, they were greeted by posters featuring their wartime photographs and the title, The return of Liberation Jazz. The concert at the recently reopened Olympia Music Hall sold out within hours. In the audience sat several members of the original 761st, including Louis and Marie, now married and both teaching at the Sorbonne, and Johnson, who had returned to study baking under Claudette's father while they decided where to build their future. These individual stories were just a few among many that connected Paris and America in the post-war years, creating channels through which ideas, art, and activism flowed in both directions. The Army's fear that African American troops might experience equality in Paris and expect it at home had proven entirely justified. What they hadn't anticipated was how effectively those experiences would be documented, shared, and eventually help catalyze a movement that would transform a nation. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.